What's up, guys? This is the Prime Design Podcast. I'm Mitra Kutsumahanina,
And I'm Ryan Srinivasan.
and we are the two halves of Cerberus Trillion, an independent game studio, video game studio, and we are making this podcast so we can make other people's games hopefully better in the future by dropping some knowledge bombs given to us by the one and only GOAT, Richard Terrell himself, who is currently working on the designoriented.net. It's a repository of game design and related info.
Yeah, so we're pulling all this info from the Critical Gaming Network Game Design 101. So each week we go through a part of that blog and just explain it and then give you some examples and talk about some other news and stuff along the way.
This week if you're going to follow along, we are going to be doing Mechanics and Abstractions Part 4. We're finishing up this section on Mechanics and Abstractions, and on the following podcast, we're going to be moving on to interplay, which is a very interesting topic. But before we get to that fun stuff, we're going to round out this section.
So, Mechanics and Abstractions Part 4. This week we're talking about a game that is on the Nintendo DS. It's called The World Ends With You, and it's an action RPG. So this game is a fourth tier abstract concrete mechanic. What is that? Like a fourth tier mechanic thing that we talked about last time.
Sure.
So it's a traditional RPG, but it's got the additional action stuff in it. And in the past, or the last episode, we talked about how these generally don't work super well together because when they try to integrate these action elements, they generally don't work super well, and then it kind of takes away from the entire game. And that's no different with this one. Yeah, so the battles are extremely abstract. There's just way too much stuff going on in all of them. So it's for the Nintendo DS, so there are two screens. If you guys are familiar with the DS, the bottom screen is a touch screen, and then the top screen is just a normal, non-interactive screen. So the touchscreen section, we'll talk about what's happening on the touchscreen first. So on the touchscreen, you have your stylus, and you're swiping and tapping to do different attacks. And all those attacks have the same reaction by the enemies, so they're going to react the same way to all of these attacks, so it's not going to be very interesting gameplay. In addition, the hitboxes are poorly defined, so the whole game kind of takes place in this semi 3D space, so the battles are kind of difficult to keep track of because there's a lot of stuff going on, and then enemies are kind of above and below you as well as to the sides of you, and it just ends up being a really big mess. So you do have the swiping and tapping mechanics to attack, but they also allow you to move the character, so you have to touch and drag the character around, and that ends up being really difficult to do with all of the on-screen things happening and the fact that it's a similar motion to what an attack would be. In addition, there's also a dodge mechanic, which is pretty much the same thing as well as the attack and movement, where it's just swiping. So it's difficult to do it, and it also isn't reactive to how quickly you swipe. So if you swipe really quickly or if you swipe really slowly, it's going to be the same movement or dodge. So the weird part about this is there's the top screen. And on the top screen, there's another player. So it's essentially you are the player on the bottom screen, and then there's also your partner, which is on the top screen. And so the top screen is a series of buttons that you have to press in order. And it's not dynamic because you either press the buttons correctly or you don't. And that determines whether or not you attack or you don't. In addition to the button attacks, there's also a card system where the player has to try to guess the correct order of cards. There's like a couple of cards at the top of the screen. You have to guess the proper order of them. If you guess incorrectly, it will give you a hint as to what the correct order is. if you once you guess correctly, then you get a special attack. Yeah, it's just there's a lot of stuff going on. Yeah, so you have these two separate screens, but they try to combine them in some ways. So you have two separate battles essentially going on, but the enemies between the two are paired up. So if you hurt an enemy on the top, it'll hurt the enemy on the bottom. And then there's also a combo multiplier. So if you swap between the two players, or you control them simultaneously and you do well at that, it gives you a combo multiplier. But it doesn't do a good job of unifying both of the experiences, and it kind of makes everything worse. And there's just way too much going on. So the combat is so complicated that the game actually allows you to have AI control the the top screen character, which is kind of ridiculous. It just seems strange that you would have an entire system and then you can opt to have AI control it. But later on in the game, you do have to be good enough so that the AI, you have to be able to do both screens because the AI isn't very good. So later on in the game, you have to be able to do both to actually continue and beat the stronger enemies.
So at the base of it all, the touchscreen attacks and the movement, those things are fine. They're good mechanics. But once you add everything else on top of those base mechanics, it just gets ruined. And so trying to master those base mechanics is rewarding in and of itself, but you have to then try and master every other system in the game. And so what happens is these abstractions just add a bunch of complexity, but don't really add any depth to the game. So the result is not enough interplay between the mechanics, and then there's not enough variation, so the user can't become creative. You either do it all in a very specific way or you fail. To further explain the abstraction in the game, there's also a food system. So when you're not in battle, the player can buy and eat food for various upgrades. And so when you eat food, the food must be digested, which I guess is kind of realistic, and then you digest a little more after each battle. But you can only eat so much for each actual real time that you're playing, for all the real time that you're playing. And so the character stomach is affected, and it either shrinks as you eat more and then it resets, and the character has likes and dislikes, and all this leads to different stats fluctuating and whatnot. And it's a whole other system that is outside the main part of the game and forces you to think about something else and whatnot. So it's like another layer of abstraction.
Yeah, there's just too much going on. It ends up just being way too complicated, and it takes away from the overall experience. And it's just they tried to do a lot of different things to try to make it a good game or like a different game, but in the end of the day, it's just way too much going on. Yeah, so we'll end with a zinger from Richard Terrell himself. The world ends with me. Too bad it didn't begin with concrete mechanics.
La 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 la. No, it's funny. It's perfect. Yeah,
comedy gold right there. So this week, the cool mechanic. Well, it's not necessarily a cool mechanic this time, but the interesting mechanic is the Assassin's Creed 2 counter system. So I really like this game, Assassin's Creed 2, a ton. But one issue I had was the combat system. So when you're fighting an enemy, you can get into a blocking stance. You just hold down the right bumper, you go into the stance, and then when an enemy attacks you, you have the ability to press a button to counter that attack. So this was cool, but eventually you figure out that you can just do this counter attack thing for pretty much anyone, and it'll automatically kill them. So it was just really, really powerful. And yeah, you ended up pretty much just doing that repeatedly. So I don't know if that's necessarily an abstract mechanic, but
I think it is. Well, it's just a bad mechanic
yeah,
almost. That's
it's
just
an
broken,
example
you know?
of mechanics kind of coming down to trial and error. So you'd pretty much just have to press this counter button at the correct time, and then it would kill the enemies, and it was just really overpowered and
Mhm.
kind of reduced combat to just doing that one thing.
Yeah, man. Mm.
Although you had the option to be more creative with it if you wanted to, but uh, yeah, that was an option. You could just do that.
It's like the noob tube of Assassin's Creed.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. All right, so we're gonna move on to our AAA news of this week. Well, not necessarily of this week, but the AAA news we're gonna cover this week. And something that we found, that Ryan found, is the crunch controversy that Rockstar is involved in regarding Red Dead Redemption 2. Now, allegedly, the team, some members of the team, have worked 100-hour weeks to ensure the game ships on time and on target. And the VP at Rockstar basically, that's what he said. I don't know if he said that as a joke or if that was for real, but regardless, 100-hour weeks is ridiculous to work on anything, much less games. Um, which, I mean, to me is it's just like, I don't know what the issue was, like for certain firms to do that, whether that's like scope creep or bad production, bad management, or incompetent employees, or just bad estimations of like production time. Or I mean, there's many things that could come into play, or there's just lots of pressure and the team had to take a break at some point. Or I mean, like, making games is not easy, and it's not especially at that level of what, there's like 50-man, 100-man teams or more at budgets of like $60 million to try and make games that are, what did you say the size of the game was?
What, it was 100 gigabyte download?
100 gigabyte down. Like, I don't remember the last software that I've ever even seen that's over 10 gigs.
Yeah, that's
And
unreal.
this is flipping ridiculous that it's 100 gigabytes. So I guess maybe they did have a bad estimation of how long it would take and how much work and man hours and whatnot, because that's a massive game.
Yeah, no, I mean, I believe that that's possible though, because I think, a lot of games, they come out nowadays and they have first, immediate patches for everything, or they have a ton of bugs and things like that. So that doesn't really surprise me that that would be a thing. Because
What, crunch?
yeah, like
Yeah, no,
crunch to
crunch
that
is,
extent,
yeah, yeah.
because these games are just getting bigger and bigger, and they need to make it happen, and they've got a lot of stuff to deliver on. So yeah, and like
Yeah.
broken games right away that are broken, that when they come out and they're broken, that doesn't do well for the life of the game. People are gonna have a bad first impression, and then they're not gonna keep playing.
No, I get the crunch. Like, you have to, like, now you have to crunch. But I'm just saying, like, if you just overshoot your production time, like you give a release date that's far out, I think it's better to say it's going to come out sooner, having finished it, versus saying, holy shit, we need to crunch or we're going to be late.
Hmm.
Because I think, wasn't, correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't Assassin's Creed Odyssey pushed back the release date?
That wouldn't surprise me at all. I'm not.
So it may or may not. I think I read something, but either way, like, it came out probably being better for it having been pushed back.
Mhm.
But I think it would have been even better. Maybe may or may not. If they said we're gonna put this game out in 2 years and it comes out in a year and a half, I think that would be better. The fans would be like, I think personally, I'd be like, hell yeah, that's way better.
Hmm.
That shows that maybe you guys, overestimated, but then you came through and made a great game with no patches or needed right away, or it just came out great. And I think I don't know, I think that's worth, maybe it's like, I don't know, maybe there's something with the business where there's like some cash flow issues where they need to put a game out every certain amount of time to meet certain objectives for the company, and
Yeah.
which forces, shorter estimates, and then
Yeah. I feel
forces
like
people to crunch.
something like that would be the case for Rockstar, because
Mhm.
they're making these Grand Theft Auto games, which are also absolutely enormous. So they have to get this one done, and then they can move on to the next Grand Theft Auto game, or
Yeah,
LA
because you
Noir
just
2.
don't have any, because they don't have any cash flow at the moment. They have nothing until, well, I mean, that stuff, but they're not going to have that big boost to make the next one until they've sold something,
Mhm.
which it's all, yeah,
Plus,
it's,
I'm sure they're scheduled out for like the next 10 years of what they want to do,
yeah.
or what they want to release, and all of that. So I'm sure they have to keep to that schedule as well.
Which to me is, it's absurd because it's hard to guess what the next game will be in terms of estimating time because of the increasing like landscape of games. Like in 5 years, I think AR VR will be completely different, and we're gonna have to. That's gonna be factored into games, and the estimates and stuff and bids you made now is gonna completely change. So yeah, maybe it's a tentative 10-year schedule. Do you know what I mean? So they have some schedule, but I think they need to switch up the way that structure works. Like really evaluate. Maybe it's running a thin line if you don't do it the way they're doing it now. You're running a thin line between not succeeding as a company and then making games. So I guess you have to do it this way. But either way, the 100-hour work weeks to me are absurd. I mean, after calculating out my schedule, after, schedule out your eating, sleeping, and everything else, like, yes, there's like still 80 hours left. But that's after you've scheduled in eating, sleeping, and stuff like that. If they're working 100 hours, that means you're not eating, or you're not sleeping, or you're not working out, or you're not, do you know what I mean? And that's
Yeah.
just on a 7-day schedule. That's not on like if you're doing that in a weekday schedule, that's ridiculous.
Yeah, that's brutal.
Yeah, that's brutal. And if you're doing that, I mean, what do you think? Let's say they did it for 1 week, a 1 week, 100-hour. That to me sounds reasonable. That's fine.
Hmm.
But to do weeks of 100-hour weeks, that sounds like 3 to 4.
Hmm.
You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like that's multiple weeks of not eating or sleeping sometimes.
Yeah, that sounds miserable.
Garbage. Yeah,
Yeah.
but
Yeesh.
all right. So I feel like, for the way that our studio works, I don't think we'll be crunching um, most of the time.
Yeah, hopefully not.
Hopefully not. All right. So now we're gonna move on to our indie game news.
Okay, so this is a little bit more of a mature subject matter. It is a text-based adventure game featuring Guenevere, or what's his name, Sir Lancelot, and King Arthur, where you basically play as Guinevere, and then you get to um, make sweet love with whoever you decide in this universe, I guess. Um, and yeah, it's pretty darn impressive because it's a text-based role-playing type thing, where you get a bunch of different dialogue options. But this is one of the first times I've seen an asexual option, instead of like you were encouraged to have sex with somebody and you can actively choose not to, which I think is really interesting, because I don't think I've played a game where that's an option. Like you can just one of the situation you're asked to, or you can have sex with King Arthur, but you can say that you aren't interested. Or there's like 10 different options. You can say you aren't interested, you are attracted to women, not men, you're not attracted to him, you're attracted to someone else, you want to withhold sex to gain power over him, or you don't like that you're forced into the marriage, and you want to take that out on him, or you just generally say no. So yeah, there's just a whole bunch of different options. I think that's really fascinating. Yeah.
That sounds like a beautiful game.
Yeah, I mean, it's very graphic, I think.
When does that come out?
Funny because it's a text-based game.
Yeah, it's.
Let's see.
Does it say?
I don't see a
Or
release
is it
date.
already out?
I would assume it's already out.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll put a link to that in the description.
Yeah, the article.
Take a look, and do some role playing.
Mm. All right, so that is the episode for this episode. You should tune in next week or next episode for the next chapter, the next article in the Critical Gaming blog, Game Design 101. We'll talk about interplay and what that means in games, and we'll use Mario as the example. So, thanks for listening. We are on every platform of social media imaginable and more. To start off, the most important one is our Twitter, which is at Cerberus Trilly2. That's CERBERUS, capital TRILLI, number 2. The number 2, not like spelled out number 2, but the number 2. Insta, we're at Cerberus Trillion. Our Snap is Sir Trill. That's CERTRILL. We have a website, servicetrillion.com, but it's not currently filled with info yet. So if you go there, it's going to be really funky. But go there anyway. It's fine. We're on YouTube at Cerberus Trillion, where we have this podcast, and we'll have other content later as our games are getting more and more finished. We will continue once we announce our game and there's some more momentum. We'll continue our dev blog on Medium, which is also Cerberus Trillion. We have a Facebook page. Guess what? Cerberus Trillion. We have a Discord. I think you guessed it, Cerberus Trillion. And at some point, I think every now and then, intermittently, we will live stream on Twitch, and that is also at Cerberus Trillion. So catch us outside on our social media, and we and so yeah, good episode.
Cool.
Yeah. See you guys. Signing off. Peace.
Oh, Jigs.